The story began on a fateful day when Kasuk found himself in a strange heavenly realm and was welcomed by a girl named Elise. She took him to her master, a goddess named Usura, who informed him that he had died in an accident and could either choose to reincarnate or get summoned to another world. Kasuk chose to be summoned but requested that his memories remain intact, so after a week, the goddess granted him his wish. Before sending him off, she imparted power onto his left eye and told him that his future would be determined by his choice at the summoning activity, so he should live wisely. He was sent through a portal, which led him straight into a sandstorm, and saw some figures in the distance whom he initially assumed were humans. It turned out that a great bear was behind him, but two angel girls screaming in terror defeated the bear in one hit. The girls welcomed him as if they knew him already, but they soon got into a petty fight, and he silenced them, asking why they referred to him as their master. They explained that Lady Usura created them both to be his assistants, and for them to begin working, he had to select one of them to stay by his side. Kasuk wasn't ready to get a headache dealing with women's matters, and he already knew that he wouldn't go wrong by choosing both of them, so he told them there was enough space on his bed for 3. They asked him to name them, so he named them Suki and Kuhai. Each girl accepted her name and was excited to finally be in his care. Speaking of the monster that had just been defeated, Suki mentioned that the demon's raw material could be sold in the city, so she would store it ahead of time. Kasuk curiously asked about the geography of that world, and the girls shared that the demons were more concentrated in the center of the island. As such, the cities were only in the coastal areas. Kasuk suggested that they secure a campsite and find food, and the ladies decided to split up but soon started fighting over who would stay with Kasuk and rest for the night in his tent. In the battle for the Great Sausage, Kuhai lost, and Mitsuki got to stay with her master. After a while, Kuhai returned with a dragon, which was their world's equivalent of a Rolls-Royce. Seeing his horrified demeanor, she reassured him that in their world, the dragon that would be serving as his ride had to be a tamed one, so he hopped on it. The ride felt great, and he soon took a liking to the dragon. The ladies were surprised that even though the dragon was already tamed, Kasuk seemed to be flying so easily on it, in much less time than it would take a usual person to fly, meaning Kasuk possessed more power than the eye could see. However, the dragon soon went berserk because Kasuk had tried modifying the dragon's strength by cutting it. He thought calmly about how to re-establish the link between them, and soon, the dragon calmed down. The following day, Kasuk told the girls to get set so they'd head into town, but along the line, his left eye started twitching and hurting, and then from the same eye, he saw spells in a foreign language. Everything overwhelmed him, and he passed out flat. He woke up to find Usura taking care of him in the garden he had earlier found himself in after his death. Kasuk was alarmed, thinking he had died again, but Usura reassured him that he was still alive, but the magical burden was too much for his body to handle, and so she had dragged his soul to escape it. She then explained that even though she had blessed his left eye, she never expected him to use it so suddenly and recklessly. Evidently, Kasuk had used the divine power he learned from Usura when he activated the power of his left eye, even after she had warned him to treat divine power with caution because his body was not used to handling such power. Anyway, the power had taken root in his body, so she advised him not to act recklessly with it again and to use a limiter. If at any point he wanted to raise his limiter's maximum divine power for his eye's power, he would have to let the power flow to his left gradually. Immediately, she sent him back to his body, where the girls were, and he found himself lying in Suki's embrace. The girls said they were frightened, especially because his soul was separated from his body for a long time, so they were willing to do everything to keep him there for a while. Much later, Kasuk, using his left eye, saw a status window and used it on the grass. He realized that that was the limiter to the amount of power that flowed to his left eye. He checked his own status, but noticed he had a question mark beside his race name, which was human. He checked the girls and found that Kuhai belonged to the sunlight race and possessed multiple skills, while Suki belonged to the moonlight race and possessed multiple skills as well. What they had in common was that they were all followers of Kasuk, so he asked them why that was so. The girls couldn't tell why, but guessed that it was because he had assigned their names to them. Before they finished talking, the city view became apparent to them, but Suki soon realized that there was a battle happening ahead, and the people being attacked were at a disadvantage. He asked the girls to hide their wings and sent Suki first, but warned her again not to show her wings in the midst of those strangers. Surprisingly, she easily got rid of the monsters and cutely returned to her master, like she wasn't the ferocious tigress a second ago. The leader of the people who had just been rescued introduced himself as Schmidt, the leader of the merchant company. He thanked Kasuk for sending Suki to rescue them, saying he had initially spoken to Suki regarding the reward, but she directed him back to Kasuk. Now, Kasuk hadn't taken that action seeking a reward, but since Suki was the one who saved them, he thought it would be nice for her to get something. He then asked to be granted a carriage to ride in until they arrived at a certain city. He also asked that Schmidt and his people purchase some of their own materials so other strangers won't find out where they got them from. However, Schmidt believed he was profiting too much from Kasuk's request, but it was all because Kasuk had no idea about market prices in that area. So in the carriage, Schmidt introduced his personal bodyguard, Goes, who was so bald one could see his thoughts. When Kasuk and the girls brought out the items they had for sale, Schmidt and his guard, Goes, were shocked to find the item box magic and the black bear's fur. Apparently, most merchants would want such magic desperately, and subjugating a black bear was proof of being a first-class adventurer. This was because the black bear itself was not a particularly strong monster, but it was difficult to get to where black bears were. Schmidt had asked if they had preserved its organs because black bear organs were useful in making medicine, but since they didn't, he offered them 2 large coins. Goes was alarmed and reminded his master that 1 large coin was equal to 1,000,000 cents, which was enough for someone to live for a year. Schmidt knew that the benefits of the black bear's fur outweighed the cost of the coins. However, he soon noticed that Kasuk seemed displeased about something. To his utmost shock, Kasuk had more fur than he had initially presented. So Schmidt expressed his shock and then said he felt jealous in a good way. Later, they arrived at the city of Rusin, where Schmidt admitted that all the black bear's fur was worth 10 large gold coins, which he currently didn't have on hand, so Kasuk agreed to take the payment in the evening. Later, he and the girls searched for a suite to lodge in and found a good one that had a bed large enough for all 3 of them. Deep down, Kasuk wasn't prepared to milk dry by these beauties, but they were already eager to get down on him. In any case, he told them it was time to head to the public guild where they could gather information. The receptionist of the guild shared with them that there were 2 types of guilds. The first was private guilds made up of multiple parties, and then public guilds where everyone could register and find jobs. Presently, they were in a public guild where there was no limit on how many people could take the same request, because if multiple people made the same request, they would be formed into a party, which had a maximum party size of 6 people. Also, each request was assigned a rank, and only parties with the corresponding rank could take on such requests. The ranks ranged from F to double S ranks, and there were all sorts of requests on the board, so Kasuk advised that they prepare that day so they would do their best the next day. One of the girls took off to gather more information, leaving Kasuk behind with the other. They ran into Schmidt, who returned with the payment for the black bear fur he purchased from Kasuk. While digging into their mail, Kasuk asked if market prices were prone to easy changes. Schmidt explained that it all depended on the quantity of items being transacted. He asked if Kasuk was interested in doing business, but Kasuk shared that he only wanted to know whether he would break the market with collected materials. In any case, they retired for the night and Suki returned, feeling exhausted and demanding a reward. Also, it seemed she was high on expired piss and already wanted to do crazy things to him. But when Kuhai caught them, she wanted in on the action, so both girls changed into their most atrocious attire and spent all night drawing Kasuk's soul through a shaft. Next day, Kasuk defeated some golems with the girls and got handsomely rewarded for the mission. Seeing that his rank had risen again, Goes congratulated them and offered to organize their rank advancement party while introducing them to others. Later that night, everyone got wasted, and in the middle of everything, Goes complimented them on progressing at jet speed, saying they might even take over the tower. Kasuk asked him to clarify what he meant by the tower, so Goes explained that in the central continent, there were 7 towers in total, all centered around the tallest one. Whoever was lucky enough to reach the top of the tower could overtake it, because it's been that way since the old days. However, there was yet to be a single person who conquered a tower in the central continent. The nation mostly owned these towers, but anyone who could conquer them would eventually become the king of a nation in the future. In the first place, getting near the tower was extremely difficult, and attempting to conquer it was even more challenging. Later that night, Kasuk was lost in thought and obviously had his mind on the whole tower issue because their party only consisted of 2 people, and people would get suspicious if they tried to do anything with them. So instead, Kasuk suggested that they find the most secure tower, conquer it, and use it as a home base. However, no matter how powerful Suki and Kuhai were, it would be difficult for only 2 of them to conquer an entire tower, so he told them to forget all about the whole tower thing. However, the girls said that if he really did want to conquer a tower, they would put in their best to make sure they actualized his dreams. Suki asked which of the 7 towers would be the best to conquer, and Kuhai suggested that since they were going to do it anyway, it would be best for them to aim for the biggest one. With that, Kasuk finalized that they would make the tallest tower their primary target. 10 days later, the squad adventured so far through the wilderness, through the winter storm, and had arrived at the tallest tower. It was so huge that it made them wonder how anyone was able to construct such a tower. Soon, Kasuk spotted an entrance and also advised the girls that if it seemed too dangerous and challenging, then they could just escape immediately. At the same time, his dragon also landed, expressing its desire to be a part of the mission. Upon getting into the tower, they found themselves in a wide open space. But with no obvious staircase to lead them to the top, Kasuk mounted his dragon with the girls, and they made their way to the skies, where they spotted a teleportation stone. Right beside the stone was a portal leading to the second floor, but they moved upwards riding on the dragon and were able to skip right up to the 40th floor without fighting any ground monsters. However, on the floors that they were not able to fly with the dragons, Kuhai and Mitsuki were able to subdue any monsters encountered, so they passed through without any trouble. However, they soon arrived at the 92nd floor, where they were unable to proceed any further with their dragons. Kasuk left his dragon outside and went on to enter through the teleportation portal with the girls. He was initially worried about how easy everything was and wondered if they were about to face even greater difficulty. But the girls shocked him beyond belief and kept slaying the monsters with barely any visible difficulty. In the end, they eventually arrived at the 100th floor and found 3 giant crystals, namely, the demonic crystal, the godly crystal, and the holy crystals. It seemed these were mechanisms connected with the tower, but this so-called system voice surprisingly belonged to Asura. They located the direction from which the sound came and saw a tower management console where Kasuk could issue commands. He hesitated to place his hands, but the girls asked him whether it was that he didn't want to become the manager, and he said that he didn't feel good assuming that position because it was Kuhai and Suki who conquered the tower, while he absolutely did nothing. However, both girls pledged their loyalty to him, saying their primary role was to protect him. Suki stated that she had no thoughts of becoming the manager or desiring the position, and neither did Kuhai, so the only person whom they could accept to become the tower's manager was their master, Kasuk. They pushed him to the forefront, and he made contact with the console, so the system began initializing the registration of Kasuk as ruler of the tower. After a while, something bright overtook the tower and everything was complete. Kasuk was asked to register his name as the ruler. Instead of using his own name, and for the sake of the future, he used the name Amamiya. On that day, a new conqueror of the tower in the central continent was born for the first time in history, and their nation began to move forward. After the optimization process had been completed, he was commanded to touch the management console to begin a tutorial. After that, the tutorial commenced, and afterwards, Kasuk's brain was fried because he finally used it for the first time. One of them suggested that instead of doing nothing, he could try giving the system an order. He got his notes, which contained a summary of the tutorial from earlier, and wondered what the first step to take was. Kuhai suggested that they remodel the floor in order to get a better hold of the basic controls, because it was relevant to start by creating a good place and habitable environment for them to live. Kasuk started by adding more rooms and organizing the architecture of the place, and after he input the changes into the control console, the rooms were installed. Thereafter, he set up furniture in all the rooms but seemed to be dissatisfied with having only 1 bedroom when there were 3 in number. However, the girls seemed unhappy that he was considering getting other rooms, so he just abandoned the idea. They later treated themselves to a nice dinner, and Suki asked how much power was left in the crystals. In response, Kasuk shared that at first, each of the crystals had 1 million divine power points and 100,000 holy power and magic power points. A good number of the divine points were used to manage the floor, so they still had a lot left. Not to mention that there was an exchange rate between the different types of crystals and the powers in the crystals. The problem was that if they continued to use the divine points mindlessly, they might run out of points, so Kuhai asked if there was a way to replenish the crystals. From the summary Kasuk had obtained, they could obtain power for the crystals from nature, living beings, and structures in the tower. Holy and magic power could be collected once a day from the terrains located on each floor. Also, divine power could be obtained by subjugating living beings or when they died from natural causes. But death from natural causes usually would give less divine power than if the monsters were subjugated instead. Since they had to continually subjugate monsters to obtain divine power, Kuhai suggested that they summon a strong monster like the black bear, but it seemed Kasuk hadn't been granted the power to summon high-level monsters. Besides, if they were going to use a summoning circle for monsters, it was basically cheaper to use holy and magic power than divine power. Additionally, the number of slimes summoned was decided by luck alone, and even if they subjugated all the slimes, they might still get fewer divine power points than were needed to do the summoning. For that reason, even if they subjugated the maximum amount of slimes they were able to summon, it would not be worth it at all. Kasuk thought hard and deeply about a solution, and still said that they should use the summoning circle after all. The girls were surprised at his contradictory decision despite all he said about gaining little with the circle, but he said that if they leveled up their tar, then most likely there would be more sorts of things they could implement. To begin with, there were levels for the tower that determined what could be configured. And even though the way to level up the tower wasn't exactly in the tutorial, the number of summoning circles used might be one of the conditions mentioned by the tower. Instead of subjugating the summoned monsters, Kasuk suggested that they didn't have to do that because it's not like they were the only ones who could enter the tower. In a nutshell, they could permit adventurers to subjugate the monsters and earn money by setting up a toll to use the transfer gate. If they created a town inside the tower and brought people in to keep it always active, it would also be an advantageous point for them. For the people to live comfortably, Kasuk planned on building 10 houses on the 5th floor before using divine power. For the rest, they would have the invited workers build it, so they would save on points. To kickstart everything, Kasuk asked Suki to share some of the magic gathered in the crystal with him so he could summon some creatures, because they would need more help, as the girls would be busy managing the tower. With that, Kasuk initiated the management of the tower. The next day, 2 individuals named Ek and Wahid bowed before him and knelt before him, and he wondered why. So Suki explained that it was because he who had summoned the creatures was their superior, and so they would kneel to him by default. Those were only 2 out of the 6 he had planned to summon, but they had to change the plan to conserve energy. Later, Kasuk successfully constructed the town on the 5th floor, but some monsters were roaming about, and he planned to get rid of them with the girls. However, the girls let him know that there wouldn't be enough time to defeat them all because Suki planned to take Ek and Wahid to the town of Rusin, so they could blend in and bring adventurers into the tower after the transfer gate was installed. She whispered something into Kuhai's ears before leaving, torturing the poor girl for the fun of it. After that, she informed Kasuk that Ek and Wahid said the tower might still be lacking appeal to the adventurers in its current state, because the adventurers stationed in the central continent were stronger than the average adventurers in their own world, and there were a lot of middle-class monsters that appeared not too far from the towns. Each floor in the tower was pretty wide, and only low-class monsters appeared up to the 40th floor, so there wasn't much to gain for high-level adventurers, meaning there would be no reason for them to come into the tower. Kasuk thought of what to do and was excited when an idea occurred to him. First, he would create a line of transit with the 5th floor, where they created the town as a basis, and then leave the passage from the 1st to the 6th floor, linking the 45th floor to the 71st floor. Afterwards, he would connect the 6th floor with the 41st floor, where there were medium-class monsters, and then back to the 7th floor from the 72nd floor. Now that he had done those crazy shuffles, he removed the transfer gates that were unneeded and completed the line of transit. However, there was an option for him to cut the connection of the crystals, but he wondered what would happen to the holy and magic power that wasn't collected. We tried by cutting the crystal's connection from the 7th floor to the 40th floor. Almost everything was finished with that, and he treated himself to a nice warm bath after a long, hard day of work. But he was surprised when he saw Kuhai's silhouette appear from behind the steam of the bathroom. She announced that she was coming into the bath, and he wanted to get out right away. But she overwhelmed him because Suki had earlier whispered in her ears that she wouldn't be returning that day. Kuhai seized the chance to have a steamy shower with her master. She jumped into the bath, with Melons taking half of the space, kickstarting the cascade of events that would lead to little Johnny destroying her fragile kitty and giving them a good night's rest. Next day, Suki returned and asked the shy lovebirds what they had been up to the previous night. Kuhai couldn't hide her shame because she was placed in all the positions that had never even existed before that night. Later, Kasuk visited the control console and learned that the level of their tower had risen to level 2. As a result, they were granted more summoning circles, which permitted them to summon up to 10 gray wolves that could serve as watchdogs. Kasuk implemented the summoning program, and gray wolves appeared on the 5th floor. Kuhai and Kasuk instantly formed a temporary bond as Kasuk's familiars. He named his first watchdog Hio, and summoned a bit more that just couldn't let him be. The girls suggested that Kasuk try to see to what extent he could command the watchdogs, and he first dispersed them in the direction of the monster's den and exterminated some of the monsters with the gray wolves. With that, his mind was at rest since he could now leave the protection of the town to the gray wolves. After returning to the control floor, Kuhai and Mitsuki summoned 2 people named Isnani and Dal, and Kuhai took them to Ryusen. so it was just Kasuk and Suki this time around. As he retired for the night, Kasuk freshened up and wanted to check on Suki since he hadn't seen her. But he found her in the most deadly pieces of clothing known to every man and realized that she had been wasted. She nicely attacked him and wheeled all his frustrations away, granting them both a great night's rest. The next day, the tower had surprisingly arrived at the 3rd level, and Kasuk wondered why they had leveled up, because it was only the previous day that he had summoned the watchdogs. He went to check on them but found that there were only 5 left out of the 10 he summoned, and he felt they had been defeated by another monster. However, he found the rest of them and realized that they had divided into groups and gone hunting separately. 2 of the wolves got the leadership skill, which was why they could split into 2 separate groups and had defeated enough monsters to the point that they leveled the tower up in just one night. Since this was an effective method to upgrade his tower, Kasuk planned to use it to his advantage. Some minutes later, Kuhai returned to them, and Kasuk shared his plans to maximize the potential of the wolves. First, they would divide the wolves into 2 groups and let one of the wolves command one group, and then summon 10 new wolves to protect the town. Afterwards, they would take the group that the other commander led to the 7th floor and install a barn and a pond, and add 20 more wolves. It was there that the wolves on the 7th floor would be positioned. Kasuk also planned to summon slimes in the floors where the wolves were as bait so that the gray wolves would become self-sufficient. Suki asked Kasuk why he chose to go through all the trouble, but he said he wanted to know just to what extent the hunting of the wolves could become a source of divine power. With that, he entrusted the floor to his appointed leader, Hill. After splitting the wolves into 2 groups, Kuhai and Mitsuki finished the last summoning but got into an argument over who would take the wolves into town. Eventually, they settled the matter by playing rock, paper, scissors, and Kuhai lost. Kusuki knew that after the girls returned, the rooms would not be enough for them and the new summons, so he added 6 other rooms and made use of them. Later, he summoned a fox named Wanli and used it on the 8th floor. As he did with the wolves, he put a barn and pond around and also summoned slimes for the fox spirits to eat. But there was also a new shrine that was awarded to the tower. Among the first 10 fox spirits that they summoned, 8 of them had the language comprehension skills and magical skills such as foxfire and illusion. Later, during dinner, Kuhai shared that 6 of the new summons were registering at the guild as a single adventurer party and had secured a place outside the city where they could set the transfer gate. However, the salary for the guards and the danger compensation for workers would be quite expensive. But Kasuk knew they could easily earn that money back by hunting monsters whenever they needed it. He also urged them to be careful so the connection with the adventurers wouldn't be exposed, because he didn't want anyone to discover his identity as the tower's administrator. After they finished eating, they went to check on the wolves on the 5th floor. Among the new group of wolves, there were 4 who had learned the leadership skill, but there weren't so many changes other than them raising the level of their skills. Unfortunately, on the 7th floor, 2 wolves had died while hunting. So he reprimanded the team leader and taught them not to be on the offensive all the time. He later refreshed himself by taking a nice nap, but the girls joined him in the end. One thing led to another, granting them all a great night's rest. In the morning, the entire tower was vibrating because Kuhai had turned it on. It was due to a new management function he had implemented, which enabled him to entrust some of the management to other people. He thought of transferring the management authority of a couple of floors to the girls, and had tried expanding the control room by adding 2 more control terminals. He had already registered them as senior managing assistants, so it was only a matter of transferring the required authority to them. Thereafter, he handed them control over certain rooms he had placed new consoles in, one containing the World Tree's seedling and another containing the Vermilinear Castle. Both new structures could allow them to generate more divine power, but finding people capable of maintaining them was the problem, so Kuhai suggested that they ask a World Tree expert. Kasuk asked Mitsuki if she knew who the World Tree expert might be, and she said she could roughly guess who it was, but if she exposed it, Kuhai might sulk. He asked her how the castle was coming along, but she told him everything was going fine, although she would keep the details a secret. He asked him what he had placed inside the shrine, and he shared that it was a divine stone that was capable of absorbing the holy and magical power of the surroundings to generate divine power. He had also placed a divine stone in the pond and noticed that the property of the pond's water changed, turning it into divine water. It seemed to revitalize the foxes and wolves that drank it, so she asked him to install it on the 5th floor as well. Meanwhile, in the study, Kuhai was busy preparing for the summoning by reading tons of books. He asked them why the summoning took so long, and Suki explained that summoning the 6 people from before didn't take much preparation because Kasuk's level was high enough. But now that they intended to summon someone of a higher rank, there were detailed procedures they had to take, which were much longer than the previous summoning. Indeed, they really needed a world tree expert. And that would take a long time, given the rank of such a person. Meanwhile, on the 73rd floor, the world tree seedling had been planted, and it was already so big for a seedling, because after growing, the tree grows so big that no other tree in their world would be able to match it. Kuhai soon started the process of summoning by creating a summoning circle, which brought forth a hot elf, the world tree expert they had been waiting for. The guy was not just an elf, but a high elf, and the moment he saw a world tree seedling, he was amazed. He first asked where they got it from, but Kuhai told him to leave it for later and introduced him to her master, Kasuk. The high elf also introduced himself as Liston, but Kasuk observed a look in his eyes that gave him a pretty bad feeling. So Kasuk entrusted Kuhai with handling their affairs and told Liston to follow her instructions from that point onward. He turned to leave, but it was apparent that something was wrong. So when he left, Liston pointed out that he frankly didn't think Kasuk was the kind of person whom someone like Kuhai should serve. However, she furiously told him that his eyes were rotten and instantly transformed into a more advanced version of her beast self. After seeing all her wings spring forth at that moment, Liston knelt to plead for his life and apologized for his rudeness. Kuhai said she forgave him that one time but wouldn't permit a second time. And later she told him that if he couldn't understand why Kasuk was their master, he should give it some time and he would soon understand. Also, if he still didn't understand why, that only meant he had the brain of an ostrich. Kuhai also warned him that Suki was the only person whom she recognized as an equal, and if Liston ever said something like that in front of her, Suki wouldn't even let him return to being a mere spirit and would destroy his entire being. Speaking of Suki, she asked Kasuk whether he was okay with Liston after seeing how rude the idiot was. However, he told her he could tolerate the fool for the time being, and had also gotten out of that place on time because he knew Suki had low tolerance for nonsense, and Kuhai would handle it her own way. Suki felt glad and warmed inside that her master thought of her, so she appreciated him with a kiss. Later, Kasuk returned to the control room and installed the Vermilineer Castle on the 76th floor. He thought deeply, realizing that a high elf was taking care of the world tree, so that meant another being had to be summoned for the Vermilineer Castle, but he didn't know exactly what sort of being. After the castle was installed, Kasuk and the girls went to check it out and found that the building was quite huge, and it was a castle as real as one could get. They were led downstairs to the basement, where the Vermilineer jewel was hidden. Since Kasuk was the owner and had commissioned Suki to lord over the castle, both of them placed their hands on the jewel for the ownership transfer process to take place. Now that Suki was confirmed as the new owner of the Vermilineer Castle, she began the summoning process, which yielded an emissary. But the moment the emissary was summoned, she thought of Kasuk as the sacrifice she would consume. This angered the heavenly spirits of Suki, who warned the brat that there were certain things she could never utter in her life, even as a joke. When she saw that Suki meant business, the emissary apologized for her rudeness, and Kasuk pleaded with Suki not to take any further action against the stupid girl. When Kasuk was introduced as the master and administrator of the tower, the emissary apologized to him for her attitude and introduced herself as the vampire Princess Shirin Vermilineer. Kasuk realized that the girl shared the same surname as the castle itself, which meant undoubtedly that the castle belonged to her family in some way. In her thoughts, Shirin couldn't believe that a mere human owned the castle, so she asked again if everything really belonged to Kasuk. Kasuk said that if the vampire princess still couldn't recognize Kasuk's power, then she would only hurry up and prove it to her. She summoned a wine glass and a small knife, and then asked Kasuk to place some drops of his blood into the wine glass. The very sight of it made the vampire princess shy and feel very hot within, and Suki told her to drink it. The moment she tasted Kasuk's blood, she realized that a basic wimpy human could possess enough riz to tame a sleazy vamp like her. With that understanding, Shirin immediately recognized and accepted Kasuk as her master. He turned back and handed over and left Suki in charge of the place, but she didn't want him to return because it was already late and he would be in danger. However, that vampire princess and the crazy looks she gave him made him realize he could die faster by staying back than by exposing himself to the dangers of the night. Kuhai and Kasuk turned to leave, but the vampire princess's gaze lingered on him. He later shared with Kuhai that after Shirin drank his blood, the girl started looking at him as prey, but Kuhai was already angry because she couldn't forgive anyone who would dare look at him that way. However, he held her back, and she landed on his bop. So he took advantage of the situation. A month after capturing the tower, the mission had progressed quite well, and Kasuk consulted one of the summoned adventurers, particularly Isnani, who shared that they were already done constructing the base, which would consume most of their time, so all that was needed was to connect the gates, since they had made connections with some notable adventurer parties. Kasuk thought deeply about something he was making that he couldn't finish in time, and then showed her a crystal in a box, instructing her to place her hands on top of it. When she did, her status was revealed, and he told her that the device was a magic tool that permitted her to check her own status. Kasuk seemed dissatisfied with the device because what they called status was a collection of people's personal information, and for the sake of making it something only visible to the owner, he tried creating something in which he could transcribe the information like a card, but that didn't go well, so the best he could do was make it display inside the box. He asked if Mitsuki and Kuhai could handle that, but the girls said they couldn't handle any tool that wasn't his. Since it had come to it, Isnani decided to step in and help complete it. Later, at the base of Kasuk's party in the city, he installed the transfer item, and the adventurers formally congratulated him on his success. He, however, told them not to be so formal with him, but they told him he was their master after all, and they were grateful for all he had done. He left the handling in the hands of an old man, and all they had to do was test the transfer portal. Kasuk and the girls disappeared through it, and the old man charged his fellow adventurers not to disappoint him. The tower had soon progressed to a point where more people could join in, and 1 week before the official opening of the tower, Liston sent a message stating that the world tree had grown enough to take root, but he needed more people to help out after the tree grew bigger. Kasuk was shocked and suspicious about this because only a few days back, Liston had summoned 2 individuals, but Kuhai explained that all 3 of them were faring just fine until recently, and as such, more people were needed. Just this time around, Liston didn't want the people to be summoned but called in from the outside. The said individuals were located to the north of the central continent, where an ancient world tree existed. But since it was completely covered in deep snow, powerful monsters capable of enduring the environment appeared and made it almost untouched by the people. However, the elves constructed a village near this world tree, and maybe it's because of a blessing from the world tree that they could live without suffering from much impact from the harsh, cold environment. For that reason, Liston wanted to ask for their help. Kasuk asked if the people would bother coming all the way to the tower, even though they were already taking care of a world tree. But Liston said that it seemed as though their own world tree would be serving out its role soon. The role of world trees was to regulate magic and holy power, but that particular world tree had fallen out of sync with the earth, which was why it had already fulfilled its role. Kasuk arrived at the world tree's site and noticed that it had grown significantly beyond his wildest imagination. He stepped closer and noticed that there were so many lights around the tree. When he placed his hand and touched it, he found out that the light was coming from a tree fairy. Liston was shocked because there was an elf legend that said there were great fairies dwelling inside the walled trees who did not appear except if they had acknowledged someone. The girls also couldn't believe that they were seeing bald tree fairies, which were supposedly confined to legends. But this also meant that Kasuk had been acknowledged by that particular fairy. They decided to observe the fairy since it had no apparent ill intentions towards Kasuk, and that was that. Meanwhile, in the North Continent, Kasuk and his party visited the elders of the elves there, and their chief was appalled to hear that they wanted to go near the sacred bald tree. The world tree was sacred to the village, and not even the villagers ventured near it. So even if Liston referred to Kasuk, he won't be allowed to get close to it. Just then, someone ran in with information for the elder who was screaming his lungs out. And for some weird reason, it seemed the priestess permitted them to enter the sanctuary where the world tree was. He ushered them in its direction, and Kasuk was pleased to see elves clothed in the Japanese priestess attire. Caused him to have a feeling of nostalgia, and his girls noticed his demeanor had changed. The Japanese priestess introduced herself as Cheryl with the bazookas and led the way to the holiest place of the sanctuary. They soon were standing in front of the world tree, which looked so beautiful and magnificent and radiated lots of light like the one they had back at the tower. However, they noticed a similar fairy to the one they had seen there, who asked Kasuk to extend his hand and touch the tree trunk. From there, she said she had passed on the knowledge she acquired while performing her role as a world tree, and that she didn't need it anymore, so he should pass it to the younger girl on the world tree in his own tower. She acknowledged that her role as a world tree had now come to an end, and she would just become just a regular large tree. Hearing this, the elder and other elves were surprised, but Kasuk looked sad, saying that from what he had just heard from the girl, he could tell that the tree would lose its status, and the world tree fairy would disappear from existence. This was even more emotional for everyone there, so Kasuk asked to have one of the tree's branches because after meeting the lovely fairy, he wanted her to remain in that branch, which he would plant beside his own world tree. He asked if she would continue existing if he did that, and she said yes, so he left that in the hands of the villagers. With that, the fairy trusted him with her life, and he took a branch from the tree. After hearing what happened from Shirl, the elves from the village understood how serious the matter was and decided to give up the tower and protect the New World Tree. When he got back home, Kasuk placed his hand on the World Tree in the tower and almost immediately noticed that the smaller fairy had grown significantly. She asked him to name her, and he called her Asina, and the elves led by Liston told him they had successfully planted the tree branch. Kasuk asked Asina to pour some magic into it so it'd grow, and when she did so, a full-grown tree developed from it. Days later, at the same time when the elves were migrating, Shirin summoned members of her clan one after the other, as well as those she needed to maintain the castle. Kasuk informed her that she was allowed into one of the control rooms, but she noticed he kept a safe distance away from her while talking to her and complained about it. For the first time ever, Suki told her that Kasuk was pretty scared of her because he felt she'd come after his blood. However, Shirin protested that he simply misunderstood her kind, because even though they consumed human blood, it wasn't a necessity for their survival and was more of a luxury. For that reason, they won't steal anyone's blood who didn't willingly offer it to them. Moreover, Suki informed Kasuk that he was bound by a blood contract to Shrin, and since she was his familiar, she couldn't harm him. Since they had gotten on good terms, Shirin pulled his head into her melons and sent greetings to his third leg. Later, she shared that there was a clan of extremely weak people named Igrids who had smallish structures and never aged. Since they needed more help at the tower, she suggested that they be summoned to the tower. Kasuk instantly accepted the idea, and Shirin excitedly brought them on board. About a week after activating the transfer gate at the Amamiya mansion, they received more visitors than ever before, ranging from people who worked at the tower's town and returned with medicinal plants to sell at high prices. The rumors of this new thing spread rapidly among adventurers overnight, and tons of them were lined up and fighting to use the gate. They were instructed to camp out, but apparently none of the adventurers planned to do so because they had heard that after entering the tower, they would obtain treasures right away. Schmidt also showed up, and the old man in charge of adventurers introduced him to one of the adventurers who had already been in the tower because Schmidt wanted to know more about the tower. Apparently, the guy and Schmidt were already familiar with each other, so Zassin, the adventurer, introduced himself and shared that he had previously tried renting a base in the tower and had obtained a super large bag of loot. He showed Schmidt his loot to convince him, and Schmidt was shocked to see that almost all the items Zassin had acquired were rare materials. In that case, if they were able to procure such every day, the life in Ryusen town would change, and they could open a really huge store and even. Meanwhile, 2 days later, Kasuk heard that the first store on the 5th floor had been opened. He additionally noticed that one of the leaders of his wolf packs, Nana, had a slightly whiter fur in addition to a new title known as the Great God's Emissary. Kasuk was confounded about this and asked Suki if she knew anything about white wolves or the Great God, but she said she knew only the barest minimum about white wolves but nothing about the Great God. However, she offered to refer him to someone whom she felt might know something about it. Later, they headed to the Elven village on the 73rd floor, and a guy named Lilith offered to be their guide. He seemed repulsed at the sight of the white wolf, and then explained that it was because white wolves were the natural enemies of elves. On the issue of white wolves, Kasuk asked him if he had ever heard about the Great God and the white wolves, and Asina responded, saying the white wolves were the personification of the Great God, who was the god of nature. She told him a high elf might know more about it, and Kasuk met Liston to ask more questions. Liston shared that a long time ago, when the world had just come into existence, the Great God used to live on its surface, and it was said that the form it had at that time was that of a white wolf. However, it was so big that the normal wolf could never match it. Hardly anyone ever believed in the story, but since the 3 fairies were real, it also meant the Great God was possibly real. Later, Kasuk thought hard about it and planned to keep looking into the matter. But just then, the multi-tailed fox, Wanli, appeared and was playing with him when Kasuk noticed that the wolf had been bestowed a divine power manipulation skill. He wondered if it was an effect of the divine stone, but wondered even more what telepathy could mean for the wolf, so he asked Suki what she knew about it. She explained what telepathy meant, and said it required both the sender and receiver to have the skill for them to be able to use it. The issue was who the receiver of Wanli's telepathy was. That was when an idea instantly popped into Kasuk's head, so he excitedly told her to go back to the control room and take Nana and Wanli as well. Also, he ran to his nerd chick, Isnani, excitedly saying that the answer was telepathy, which could not work unless there were 2 people, a sender and the receiver. In other words, for their box, they only had to create a destination for the data and have another box be the receiver and output. and if they set the card as the output destination, they would be able to record the data on the card. They both obsessively went on to try to make it work and eventually succeeded. The functionality of the box was complete, but the design was still lacking. Just then, Shirin came in and attacked him with her golden globes for being so carried away by his card that he totally forgot about her. As an apology, he offered to create a card for her, and when she tested it, she realized it displayed all her abilities. Shirin was so impressed that she said it could be classified as a form of super technology, but Kasuk felt she was just exaggerating. To her, this was no exaggeration because in the first place, no one should be able to use divine power, but it came so easily for Kasuk, and he had even gone on to create a tool with it. Speaking about the decoration of the cards, she told him to consult the Igrids because, just as she had told him, they were a clan of smallish people who loved living underground and digging holes to stay in. For that reason, they were extremely excellent with their hands and were even better than the dwarves. Following her advice, Kasuk agreed to meet the Igrids for the first time, but because of how sudden their visit was, it seemed like the Igrids were timid and afraid. But the moment Kasuk requested that they help decorate the cards, the girls willingly did as he asked, and were surprised to discover that he used divine power to create the cards. They decorated the card without causing any technical difficulties and made a few decorated samples for him. At the same time, they expressed their gratitude to him for giving them a safe space to live in. He was excited and planned to make time to visit them again. Thus far, the first adventurers had arrived at the town of the 5th floor, and the Igrit migration also went well. Things seemed to be getting more lively in the tower, and thanks to Liston's good effort, more elves were migrating to the tower. Also, Kasuk remembered that the priestess attire he saw reminded him of Japanese attire and made his heart skip a beat. Coincidentally, Suki and Kuhai showed up in the Hooters version of the kimono, cosplaying as the priestesses of death. On the 5th floor of the tower's town, Schmidt was led into a building where the administrator of the tower would be waiting for him. He was utterly shocked to see that it was Kasuk who was the administrator, and shared that he wasn't shocked to see that they had conquered the tower. The reason for their meeting was that Kasuk wanted to establish a guild that would not only be like the adventurers of the tower, but rather a combination of both of them, which he planned to call Crown. Kasuk handed Schmidt the guild card that he created, which he explained could display the skills belonging to the card's owner. Since he looked curious, they permitted him to give it a try, and after placing his hands on the crystal, Schmidt saw a detailed list of every skill he possessed. Kasuk planned on making the card his guild's registration card and members' identification, because he felt that that would make them outstanding among the guild. Because they had something that set them apart from the rest, people with different talents would come to them, giving them the upper hand when conducting negotiations. However, Schmidt raised the point that if other people could use one's identity card as their own, then the card would lose all meaning. However, Kasuk told him not to worry about that because there were things like ripples that appeared when someone used magic power, and when a card was made, the ripples would be registered on the card. If someone still tried to rewrite them, the contents in the card would be erased, meaning that even though it was possible to use that box tool to rewrite the card's content, it would be quite difficult, given that the tool required divine power to work. This was another shocker to Schmidt, who realized that the card he was holding was a divine tool, so he asked Kasuk why exactly he entrusted him with all that information. Kasuk revealed that it was because he was interested in making Schmidt the leader of the merchant division of the guild. Schmidt felt honored, and said that with how incredible the tower was, any organization created by its ruler would bring multiple advantages. But whoever stood at its top would become the target of the already existing guilds outside the tower. For that reason, Schmidt didn't think he had the confidence to go against the old foxes at the Merchants Guild, but he was really interested in Kasuk's proposal and asked for some time to think about it. Kasuk said he was thinking of giving a sort of privilege to whoever would hold the card. Firstly, people had to pay a toll to pass through the transfer gate, but for the merchant, who definitely had to come and go through it constantly, it was burdensome. So Kasuk believed that he would permit Schmidt to use the transfer gate free of charge. Instantly, he struck a chord in Schmidt, but also went on to add that he was planning on adding more transfer gates. So if Schmidt were to accept Kasuk's proposal, he could even choose the location of the next transfer gates. Schmidt immediately went into high-thinking mode, realizing that if they were able to convert the town into a stopping point and come and go in between the other towns on the continent, the value of the cards would be exponential. Immediately, Schmidt said that there was no merchant who would pass by such an appealing proposal, and that he gladly accepted Kasuk's terms. The men sealed the deal with a friendly handshake, and Kasuk retired for the night. When Schmidt left, Kasuk's senior employee and the guild's manager suggested that they hire more people to be able to manage the guild. So to employ that, he suggested that they employ slaves. There were 3 types of slaves. The ones who committed a crime, had a debt, or sold themselves, and any one of such slaves would be good for work, so the old man only wanted to seek Kasuk's approval for that. Even though Kasuk wasn't completely convinced by this idea, he knew they needed more people. However, Suki suggested that they start with around 10 people, and they could also employ battle slaves as guards. But before he knew what was going on, she wanted to be his slave for the night. Next day, Kasuk took a walk with Kuhai and noted that they had not been alone for a while, so he asked her to take a break. The poor girl said she had been exhausted from caring for the tree. But right then, Esina magically popped out of nowhere, saying she wanted to have fun. While they played with the animals, Kasuk noticed that the white wolf and fox had not particularly increased in divine power and had stayed on level 1, probably because they weren't using divine power regularly. He wondered how to raise their power and started by creating a ball out of magical power and telling the fox to hold it. The little one was scared, so they tried it again, and Wanli suddenly was playing with the divine power ball. Following that, Nana did the same thing, and then Esina too. Kasuk was confident that their skills would increase in level if they continued using divine power, and since everyone was having fun with it, it was defeating 2 birds with 1 stone. Much later, Suki interrupted them, saying that Schmidt had sent one of the first locations where he suggested installing the new transfer gate. The first place Schmidt proposed was a town called Nansen, which was located exactly opposite Ryusen. Even though Schmidt had given a pretty solid explanation, Kasuk felt he would only accept the proposal by confirming the location's viability himself. They arrived at the control tower, but Kasuk realized he couldn't use the transfer option only to arrive at that place because it would only be a one-way trip. Suki suggested that they use her teleport magic instead, but Kuhai threw a fit because she wanted to spend some time with Kasuk. However, Kasuk patted her on the head, saying her role was important, as she had to take good care of the elves. And soon enough, he was zapped into the town of Nansen with Suki's teleportation magic. He noticed that the bustling town had many craftsmen because there were abundant resources found in the mountains around it. The supply of workers was not keeping up with the demand for new buildings in his tower, so Schmidt was hoping they could invite some more skillful craftsmen into the tower. Firstly, Kasuk stopped by the town of Nansen's public guild. Then, 2 elf girl baddies were arguing, drawing attention from the other adventurers who couldn't get over their beauty. However, it seemed one of the girls, Sylvia with the silver hair, was hoping to catch a certain person's attention. A person, none other than the idiot with the fox on his head, Kasuk. Kasuk and Suki went over to the quest board and saw lots of ranked quests, mostly related to craftsmanship, due to the nature of the town. He supposed that he might find a good craftsman if he simply followed the quests issued by the Craftsman Guild. But while he was deep in thought, a bunch of malnourished-looking delinquents came to ask for trouble. He said he was only looking at requests on the board, but their scar-faced leader decided to teach Kasuk a lesson. However, it was Suki who ended up teaching the fool a lesson, and the other idiots were terrified after seeing their leader down in one move. Kasuk and Suki soon headed out since the guild employees were coming, but on their way out, the leader of the delinquents was terribly upset that he had been made a fool of publicly, and so he told them to try again because there was no way they could beat him and his goons at the same time. Kasuk noticed that the people in the town were strange because guards were not even trying to stop the idiot, even though he was making so much of a ruckus, so there had to be more to this group of deviants. He left Suki to manage the fools while he went around to investigate a couple of things. On the other hand, the elf baddies Sylvia and Colette also heard the ruckus that was going on and went to take a look. It was a nice show seeing Suki effortlessly beat those idiots to a stupor and make them pass out without taking their lives. After that, the leader was barely struggling, and Kasuk said he had some questions for him. Before Kasuk would even ask him anything, the idiot refused to cooperate, saying he had no reason to answer his questions. So Kasuk instructed Suki to ensure the idiot would never harm anyone again. She immediately sprang up to chop off his sword, but Sylvia immediately stepped in front of him to protect him. Kasuk recognized her from the guild, and Colette finally caught up to her, asking what she was doing. However, Suki almost attacked them, asking if they were also involved with the boy. Sylvia said they weren't, but that Suki was pushing it too far by punishing the guy any further. They introduced themselves, and Kasuk asked Sylvia if she knew what the delinquent had been doing. She said she was unaware, and he went on to explain that the guy and his goons came after his partner, Suki, to pick a fight with her. The fools had most likely been aiming for her for a while, so they could have fun with her. Sylvia was shocked, and Mitsuki asked her if she could use the Eye of Truth because she was a clerk, and so she said she could. Sylvia explained to Kasuk that when one used the Eye of Truth on someone, a red light would appear whenever they lied, and a blue light would appear whenever they were telling the truth. So if they used it together on him, there would not be a way for them to falsify the results. Idiot wanted to run off, but Kasuk's wolf stopped him, and the girls immediately began to use the Eye of Truth on him. The first thing they asked was whether he had been doing the same thing to others habitually, but the guy refused to answer, and she told him it was pointless to play the fool. Before he would even answer that one, she asked him how many girls from other parties he had murdered, but the idiot said he didn't know. Since he refused to answer, Suki really was going to take his arm. He responded truthfully, saying he couldn't really remember because he couldn't count them all. The next question he was asked by Kasuk himself was how an insolent fool could walk around town without a care in the world, almost as if someone in the town was covering up for him. The idiot burst out laughing, saying that even if they got caught by the executioner himself, they had someone who could get them out of any sort of problem without issues. With that, Suki knocked him out with a super kick, and Kasuk told Sylvia and Colette that that was the reason why they were punishing the delinquent like that. Kasuk instructed them to leave dealing with those fools to the guards, but also stated that there was no way the person backing the thugs up would remain calm after knowing the ruckus both of them had made, so they had to get away. Sylvia and Colette also planned to get away as well and run off, so Suki asked Kasuk whether he planned on defending those two girls. Apparently he planned to, and the reason was that a sinner had taken a liking to them. Suki was glad that it wasn't as though Kasuk was attracted to them, especially that woman of God with supreme-sized jugs that were much bigger than hers. Just then, they noticed that the guys had also disappeared, so they followed behind Sylvia and Colette to protect them. While the girls were alone, Colette reprimanded Sylvia, saying that wanting to intervene was one thing, but she didn't need to go as far as using her powers. She asked Sylvia why she decided to intervene back then, and the priestess said she only felt like she couldn't let Kasuk do things like that. With the flushed expression on her face, Colette could tell that Sylvia had fallen in love at first sight. But just then, they were ambushed by some men who were way too fast for them to protect themselves from. But miraculously, Kasuk's wolf attacked the men and dropped one of them, while the fox handled the other guy. Suki and Kasuk finally showed up, and Kasuk explained that they had a feeling the guys were going after them, so they decided to follow them. However, Sylvia was only shy, hoping Kasuk hadn't heard her getting excited because of him. They decided to get out of that area, and Kasuk looked at their job titles. Sylvia was an Ares priestess, while Colette was Asena's priestess. Ares was one of the three main gods worshipped in their world, so it meant Sylvia was one of her followers. Sylvia asked Kasuk whether they could join his party, but he said there was a condition to join that had to be fulfilled by them. He told Asena to come out, and she ran to hug Colette. However, the moment Colette found out that Asena was a world tree fairy, she immediately knelt to worship her without thinking. Kasuk said he had even more regarding the tree fairy to inform her, and announced that it seemed Colette had been chosen to be Asena's priestess. The girl was visibly shocked and went flipping a million times, making the tree fairy wonder whether Colette didn't want to be her priestess. However, Colette said she was only a bit surprised. The tree fairy said that while Kasuk was her daddy, then Colette would be her mommy. This instantly angered Sylvia, who asked Colette how she could dare have a kid without sharing the information about her. But Colette had to inform the empty brain that there was no way she could have a child with someone she had just met that day. The girls soon went back and forth bickering, so Kasuk calmed them down by asking Sylvia if she had heard of the name Eris, because she was the Erisamal goddess's priestess. She said it did ring a bell, and she had read in some books that Erisamal was called Eris, but it was something she only allowed the other gods to call her. Sylvia was asked which gods she could use that name to call Eris out, so she said that it was most likely Erisamal herself and the other two main gods, called the Spice God and the Jamir God. She asked Kasuk why he suddenly asked that, but he only asked her another question, which was whether she had ever tried divine descent. She said she had, and he said that the fastest way to explain everything to her was via the divine descent, and he would like her to try it on him. She took his hand and summoned the goddess Eris for him, but when the goddess appeared, she told Kasuk that it wasn't good for him to call her out there forcefully. Also, the invocation wouldn't last long, so she informed him about that. And soon, she left Sylvia's body, leading the girl to pass out. And Sylvia got up. She realized there was an incredible amount of divine feeling lingering inside her. So Kasuk calmed her down, seeing that this upset her in some way. As Colette watched all of this, she was quite shocked that she had seen not just a wild tree fairy, but also one of the three main gods, Eris too. At the same time, Sylvia thought hard about how she had seen Kasuk call Eris by her nickname so casually. And so both girls were wondering just who exactly he was. Clearly knew they had so many questions, so he invited them to his base, and they got into Mitsuki's teleportation portal. All this while, a hooded figure had been listening in on their conversation and reported to his leader, saying that Kasuk and his party got away using teleportation magic. The old man was angry but swore that even though he couldn't hurt them since they had already left his town, the moment they returned, he wouldn't tolerate any form of failure in hunting them down. Much later, Kasuk and his entourage arrived at the tower, known to Colette and Sylvia as the Amamiya Tower. However, after seeing that the gate was shut and there was no way in, Colette was curious, wondering how they would make their way in. To her surprise, Kasuk activated a magic circle and placed his hands on the gate, after which they were teleported into the tower. He welcomed them into his tower afterwards. Shirin, on the other hand, had been missing him and all the torment she usually dished out to him. So when she saw him suddenly show up at the castle at the tower, she excitedly jumped on him to welcome him. When she noticed 2 new additions, she also said she wasn't surprised, knowing how easy it would be for Kasuk to make baby mamas even out of nuns. When they gathered later, he reintroduced himself as the tower's administrator and told the curious Kuhai that Colette was the girl chosen to be Asina's priestess. He left Colette in Kuhai's hands and told Sylvia that he could get her anything she needed from the console command. Without much hesitation, she shared that her one dream while she was in Nansen was always to have a temple, because she never thought she would ever experience a divine descent firsthand. But now that she had, she needed her temple. After thinking about it, Kasuk realized that it was on the list of things he could install from the console, so he installed a temple for her, because he also thought it would be a nice way for him to contact the goddess Asura. He also made rooms for Sylvia and Colette while resetting the layout and interior of the place. Afterwards, he tried getting some ceremonial utensils for the temple, but found that they were quite expensive. When he inspected the rooms he created for Colette and Sylvia, he found them to be perfect, and was also glad that the living room had been nicely expanded. Now that the rooms were set, he told them to use them as they pleased while informing Suki that they had to tell Wahid and the others about the incidents that transpired at Nansen. Several days later, in the city of Nansen, the older guy who seemed to be the official backing those criminals up was arrested by the police. He wondered who on earth could have the authority to give a warrant for his arrest, but noticed that the signatures of every important person in their town were present. The chief of police told him that that was their way of letting him know that he wouldn't be able to stay scot-free and corrupt forever. Thereafter, he was seized and taken to the station. That was all thanks to the efforts of the adventurers working for Kasuk, as they had spent nights gathering sufficient evidence to keep the tyrant behind bars. They also thought it would be better to advise Kasuk not to make use of the city but left it as a final decision that he would make himself. Much later, Sylvia found herself unclad and standing before a strange lady. It seemed Asura had appeared to her to share that Kasuk, whom Sylvia had fallen in love with, would be quite the hard nut to crack, and she would fail to make him hers alone because he belonged to the streets. However, the goddess said she was rooting for her anyway, and she should do her best. When she woke up that morning, it was Kasuk's voice that woke her up, as he wanted to know if they could perform another divine descent for the goddess Eris at the temple. Sylvia again summoned the goddess, and she spoke through her to Kasuk, saying there was no need to get any expensive ceremonial utensils. The goddess also asked Kasuk whether he was having the time of his life, and he affirmed it. Well, she said she was glad because, just like Asura had instructed him, he had the freedom to do whatever he wanted to do. But the path he chose was the most important to them. Also, there was no need for him to hold himself back just because he had Kuhai and Mitsuki. Kasuk assured her that he wasn't relenting simply because he had some, and he would continue working just as hard without burning out. Afterwards, Ares finished her session with him and left Sylvia's body as soon as she could. After that, the tower leveled up to the 5th level, proving the power of Ares as a goddess. As a result, they got a new summoning circle, and Kasuk planned to use it to install more monsters so they would get more points. The number of summoned monsters was random, so they could still earn points if they installed the circles constantly. However, some of the new monsters would certainly fall victim to them among the wolves and foxes, but trying wouldn't harm them. Kasuk additionally added seasons on each floor, like snowfall, rainy, and dry seasons. These seasons and other changes consumed tons of points, and the amount of points that could be stored had increased in the magic power crystals. But it wasn't certain that they would keep gathering such a maximum amount of points like they had done up till that moment. While Kasuk was hard at work, Shirin, Nana, and Wanli joined him, and she interpreted that Nana and Wanli said they would like to have their numbers increased, and that Kasuk should increase wolves and foxes. It was quite surprising that Shirin could communicate with them. So she explained that even though she wasn't fluent in speaking Zu, she could tell what they meant to a certain degree. Kasuk took this as a sign that if they used the spirits as intermediaries, they would be able to talk with Nana and Wanli a little, and such a race that could communicate with spirits would be extremely powerful. He asked Shirin if the elves could also do the same thing and soon summoned Colette, who was rather confused. He asked her whether she could communicate with spirits, and she said that being an elf, she had an idea how to interpret what the spirits were saying. Shirin told her, that it also meant she could talk to the fox and white wolf, because those could also communicate with spirits, so they would certainly be able to communicate with her. She did try communicating with them and realized that it was happening just as Shirin said, and she even said she was communicating with the pets about the floors where their friends were. After confirming that she could communicate with the animals, Kasuk asked his wolf whether she wanted to increase their number of wolves and how many more members had to be added. The wolf said that if Kasuk doubled the number of wolves, that would just be fine, and the same thing applied to the fox. Later in the garden, Asura was lost in thought, thinking about Kasuk, when Ares and her friends excitedly approached her, talking about how much Kasuk had achieved in such a short time. They seemed excited that she had successfully hidden his existence from the other gods, and it wasn't strange knowing she was the only one who could do that. However, Ares asked her why she did such a thing. Asura explained that she couldn't abandon Kasuk on his own after investigating the reason why his soul arrived there. Though she felt sending him to Asgard might create something amusing, she told them to keep silent about it and revealed a book named Asgard. Obviously, in their world, gods had a strong influence, so if they all interfered in Kasuk's matter, there would be chaos, but it was okay if the boy himself sought them out as he did Eris. In other words, they could all watch over him from behind the scenes. Days later, Kasuk noticed that the changes implemented had become very fruitful for the tower. There were lots of foxes and newer rabbits with gray wolves hunting them too. He had installed the rabbits with their summoning circle, added fox spirits, and built a new barn. Meanwhile, in the town, there were about 120 adventurers on the 5th floor, which was connected to Ryusen. About 20 people were employed by Crown, his guild or association, while the rest of the people in town were adventurers, merchants, and craftsmen. He had noticed some of the buildings under construction finished nicely, meaning more adventurers would gather there, and had also increased the difficulty of the dungeon in such a way that every higher floor one ascended was more difficult. Beginner class and middle class dungeons ranged from the 51st floor to the 60th, and middle class and high class dungeons ranged from the 61st floor to the 70th floor. The high-ranked adventurers finally started pouring into the middle floors, and since they hadn't arrived at floors with dungeons before, he brought the middle and beginner class dungeons down a couple of floors. Also, he added treasure chests, but he only wished he could manufacture the items that were inside them. Later, he held a meeting with his staff and introduced Sylvia as the new high priestess. His senior staff was surprised, saying high priestesses were only found in temples since they conveyed the will of God to the people. The flustered Sylvia also agreed with this, saying she could only conduct a divine descent once and had only survived that because she borrowed a bit of his power. However, Kasuk told her that the only thing he did was summon Eris through her because Eris herself had chosen Sylvia to be her vessel. With that, the girl was convinced that she'd made the right choice when she decided to follow Kasuk. That aside, Kasuk spoke about adding one transfer gate in the town of Nansen, but he said he had something to ask of Schmidt. The plan he had was to install 2 transfer gates at the same time in the towns to the north and the south, meaning the farmer's town and the clergyman's town. This was because, after considering what happened in Nansen, he thought it would be good to divide the dependence they had on the towns. Schmidt agreed that to divide the risks efficiently, it would be better for them to install the gates in one go and set up some restrictions for using the gates by those who weren't members of their own organization. The old man was tasked to handle it and said they were already issuing temporary passes, so whenever they would introduce the cards belonging to their organization, management would be easier, as it would make it faster to register and check people's holy and magic power layout. Kasuk said he would try to mass-produce the cards and introduce them early, and then thanked everyone for their great effort. Later, Sylvia asked him whether he would be going to a certain place so she could accompany him. The reason was that the town was a sacred place for the worship of 3 main gods, and if she went there, she might be able to learn something about divine descent. He asked the girls if there was anyone else who wanted to come along, and Kuhai excitedly said she was going to follow him without hesitating. Shirin additionally said she was going to tag along, and Colette said she wasn't in the middle of training with Cheryl. They eventually arrived at the town of Mixen, located to the south of their continent. Most of the people in that town cared little about being attacked by monsters and devoted themselves to worship. To handle the number of believers, there were also many clergymen living in the city. As they walked in, they were thrilled by the amazing architecture of the temples made for the 3 main gods. To the right and left were the Jamir and Spica temples, while the one in the center belonged to the goddess, Eris. They were all excited to walk into one of the temples when Shirin instantly felt something in her that was pretty morbid. She instantly said she would return for the night and part ways with them, while Kasuk and the girls ventured into the temple by themselves. But to his greatest shock, he found traces of the Everspring Garden, where he was initially reincarnated. Does this mean the MC was never reincarnated and the goddess tricked him? Also, why was Shirin repelled by the temple? If you'd like to find out in part 2, type in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.